For those who do not know me, I'm Pastor Larson. I'm the pastor here at Atonement. For our presentations these next couple days, they're from Dr. Adam Koontz. I would read off his bio, but that's long. All right. I see you're the director of field education now. How long has that been?
2 years.
2 years. All right. You took it over from Pastor Pless, I'm assuming?
Yep, that's right.
That's right. All right. I don't know if Pastor Proctor had good experiences on field ed, but I loved my field ed. I even went there after I was done helping, and I kept helping there because they were such great people. So I pray that you're a blessing for all those on field ed. As we get going, I think the easiest way for how do you want to deal with questions? That's going to be our hardest thing.
Yep. So because we're on Zoom and energy can dissipate quickly, let's do roughly 20-minute segments in the hours that we have. And I kind of wrote my outlines in 20-minute segments, kind of 3 segments per hour. I'll stop after roughly 15 or 20 minutes for questions that you guys have. That'll go as long as you need it to, then we'll keep going.
All right, that sounds perfect.
Yeah.
And we'll just ask the questions via this microphone right here. So once we get to that point, we'll walk the microphone around and whatnot. We'll be ending this part of the presentation at 7:45 today, so 7:45. And then we'll take down the screen and get ready for our service, which will be at 8. In your packet, you should have a service bulletin for all 3 services during the weekend. So when you come back tomorrow, bring those with you so that I think we have extras, but if you could just keep yours with you, that makes it a lot better for how much we have to print and pay Toshiba. So we appreciate that. Yes, Chuck.
Page 22, it says Vespers for February 4th. I think that should be February 5th, should it not?
Probably. I only looked at that about 100 times and was trying to figure out all the stuff. There's always one thing that's going to be off on it. So, yeah, that's supposed to be February 5th. So we'll do Vespers tonight, then Matins tomorrow morning, and then Vespers to end our time together. That will not be on Zoom, of course, and we will also not be recording those services. We're just going to record the 4 presentations that we have from Dr. Koontz, and and that will be available actually publicly on YouTube. I know we record all of our services here privately, and we send that via a private link, but for these 4, we'll have that publicly for everyone, but we won't have any of the services. All right. Any other questions? So after the presentation, after we're done at 7:45, then I'll give you announcements for what's going to happen tonight at the party, also for the service, and then for tomorrow. I appreciate all of you being here tonight. I was hoping you guys would still show up to watch and to ask your questions and whatnot. If this has always been my worry. I've had this worry for the 5 years that we've had this, because we always ask people who are from cold climates to come here pretty much, except for one, because they always will say yes because we aren't Indiana in February. But I always worried they're going to get snowed in one of these days. But thankfully it happened after COVID, because we can do this Zoom thing. We would have had no shot before COVID around here. We would have just been looking at each other saying, I don't know. What do you do? I don't know. So we're very thankful that we understand Zoom. Unfortunately, we understand Zoom a little too much nowadays. But Why don't you take it away, Pastor, and thank you very much for being
in progress.
being our presenter and recording it too, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, thank you. I want to start just with the creatures, and then you name things about yourself and your life, your body and soul, your eyes, ears, and all your members, your reason and all your senses. And you're saying very specific things about your life. And then at the very end of the catechism, when you get to the table of duties, you're also saying very specific things about life, about families, about governments, about churches, about how to conduct yourself when you're older, when you're younger. And those specific things are, however, I think very often forgotten. So our people know that there is a specific way to talk about the very beginning of the world, but it's less clear when they're teenagers how specifically they're supposed to think about what they should do at that time of life, how they should be, how they should try to make themselves relate to other people. And if they don't have a very specific idea of what to do or how to be, my contention is they're going to end up being something very specific that simply is not in line with the Bible. Because there are lots of other ways of being and also ways of becoming someone else that are on offer today. When we think about the things that people want to be today, a lot of us, maybe even all of us, here tonight or listening to this later, think to ourselves, wow, the world has become a really crazy place. The world has changed radically. I can remember, raise your hand if you can remember, when Barack Obama was against gay marriage. Because, as a Christian, he thinks it's between a man and a woman. That was not that long ago, right? And so some things are very constant, like the weather in the northern Midwest is horrible at this time of year. That's a constant. That was true in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president the first time, and it's true today. So I'm very sad I'm not with you guys, but you can agree with me that if that's constant, the thing that's not constant is both the array of options for people's lives, not just gay marriage, but who knows what else is being mainstream through various articles, whatever. But also, things that in 2008 or even 2018, most of us had never heard of, which it is now practically heresy, depending on where you work or where you go to school, to say that you have any disagreement with. Especially the idea that a man could turn into a woman or vice versa. And I don't bring that up to scare people. You're already scared enough if you are by the news. I bring that up to make it clear how rapidly we are changing on things that really are covered, if you think about them in terms of our catechism, under the first article of the Creed, the article on creation. And because there are things that aren't specifically about the beginning of the world, strictly speaking, the media isn't forcing you. They already assume you don't believe that the world began so many thousands of years ago in a specific way by God's word. They're all past all that. They are instead replacing that idea with the idea that human beings can and should, if they're really thinking clearly, if they're thinking in ways that are free and beautiful and inspiring, human beings will turn into anything they want to turn into. Just think about the idea that you're getting, okay, pictures you can find on very normal websites, things that used to seem sort of standard to me. So if you go into an airport still today, probably they have CNN on the TV. And we can probably all remember when that seemed like kind of a nonchalant fact of life. Just CNN or headline news. And they're just kind of telling you this is where the president was today, and here's a big storm that's happening in Florida, or whatever the case may be. Now, you get, I think, much more openly, not that the 1990s were somehow preserved for propaganda, but much more openly now, you get the idea that we're putting on TV in front of your face, maybe in front of your children or your grandchildren, the idea that a man can be pregnant. This is obviously biologically and creationally absurd. It's logically absurd. It simply doesn't actually happen. What you're asked to do with the words that you use, whether at work or maybe your kids or your grandkids at their schools, you're being asked to say that that thing which is absurd, which goes against any notion of truth or coherence, is right because someone else has just asserted it, because someone else has simply said, this is the way it is. Not all women have female body parts, right? Men can get pregnant. Whatever kind of absurd, illogical thing you can think of, you must now assent to that. Behind this crusade is not just a variety of political movements or historical actors. It's very basically the idea that God did not make life in the certain, particular, blessed ways that he did. So the kid doesn't have to be confronted in, say, history class, straight on, full force, with the idea that God didn't make the world in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Because something much more insidious is underneath that already. And that is the idea that God didn't make anyone in any particular way at all. Instead, we are people who through various, it could be hormone replacement surgeries, it could be anything, we are people who make and remake ourselves. The clearest way to see this is just through the language that we are asked to use. So instead of saying biological sex, it's called your gender, which is the term that is taken originally from grammar. If you ever studied Spanish or French or something like that, you'll know that certain things are masculine or feminine, and you get really absurd things with grammar sometimes. So a little girl in German, for example, is neither masculine nor feminine, but neuter. I don't know why. It's just a silly thing in that language, right? So already the idea of sex, which used to simply mean are you a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, now is called gender. And gender is described not as existing or being, what gender are you, but what gender were you assigned at birth, and what gender do you present yourself with. And I am both old enough and young enough to have seen these things change just in the time that I've been in higher education. So from the time that I was a freshman in college until the time that I graduated from graduate school, we changed, not, if this makes you feel better, at the seminary in Fort Wayne, we're not doing this, okay? So just, full disclosure, no problems there. But when I started in undergrad, even though it was a very liberal environment, very left-wing environment, no one was saying, my name is Adam, and my pronouns are he, him. By the time I got out of graduate school a couple of years ago, that was pretty normal, and I was unusual in making an introduction that just said, my name is Adam, and not providing my pronouns, which at this point has become sort of a mischievous thing to do because then they're not sure what to say to you. So they just end up saying Adam, Adam, Adam a lot, where they would have used pronouns. It's very silly, but that's the way it can go. That change is a change, I don't think, just in social behavior patterns. It's It's not just a change in the way that our children are being educated. It's most basically a change in the way that we are being taught to think about ourselves. So the things that I want to talk about tonight and tomorrow, the next several hours that we have together, are things that are basically about how God has made us to be, not just that He has made us. That's radical enough, the fact of that. But under greater or nearer assault is the idea of how He has made us to be. That we are not fundamentally constituted. Our lives are not what they are because of our choice. That is, we are not defined by choice. Our lives are defined at their most basic levels, not by choice, but by divine gift. So when we're talking about this way of speaking, as we talk about the three estates, I want you to remember that if someone has a problem with that first article of the Creed on creation, he will also inevitably run into severe misunderstandings and problems when it comes time to talk about that second article of the Creed, which is properly speaking about our redemption, about our salvation. Because if I have the idea that for whatever reason and expressed in whatever ways, that my life is the result of how I have chosen and whom I have chosen to associate with and who I have chosen to become, and also who I may become later on. If that's what life is about, my choices, then why would I ever believe a gospel that is about God's choice and not mine? It truly makes no sense whatsoever. So our gospel, our doctrine of redemption, how has Jesus Christ reconciled God to man and man to God through his death and resurrection? Our gospel rests on the assumption and the foundation that we have been made, we have not made ourselves. It's the self-making that is at the heart of the rebellion against God that we see throughout our society at this point, openly and clearly in a way that maybe 20 or 30 years ago was not, at least to many of us, quite so open or quite so clear. As we talk about self-making, remember therefore what the stakes of this are and what it is that we're talking about. The stakes are not only that we would be right or correct or have a better understanding of God's revelation. That's always important. The stakes are, however, I think more urgently, people's souls. If they don't understand where they came from, how they got to be here, who they were made to be, they will also not understand who they need to become or what they need to do, especially when it comes to repentance and faith in Jesus Christ. Their lives won't make any sense because they think that those lives have somehow just kind of fallen into being, and then they make a couple of picks based on the hand that were dealt. Those are the stakes. So we will be talking about how theology relates to life, not about how bad everything has gotten or what's wrong with the world. As Christians, we should not really ourselves be surprised that the world is in revolt against God. This has, in fact, always been the case. We simply live at a time in which that revolt is more open. Think about it as the difference between guerrilla warfare and open warfare. It may be that 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, the warfare that Satan and his minions were making on the church, certainly in the United States, was more like guerrilla warfare. He was so small in his forces, and his forces were so few and so weak at a time when At Christmas time and Easter time, often the skyscrapers in Manhattan would be lit up with crosses. It was a different world. And so, if he wanted to attack people, he would have to do it in surreptitious ways, sneaking around, firing from the bushes, and when fired upon, he would have to run away quickly because he didn't have the forces to go into open combat against the angels of light at that time in this place. Now, his forces are much greater. Satanism is an open practice of an increasing number of people. I meet all kinds of people in their 20s who are into Wicca or some other form of witchcraft. It's pretty open, it's pretty clear, it's pretty obvious. So we shouldn't be surprised by it. It may simply be the difference between the relative peace of trying to suppress a guerrilla campaign versus the relatively more strenuous task of engaging in open warfare on a battlefield against an army that's relatively as strong and relatively as well equipped as yours is. That might simply be the difference between 1952 on the one hand and 2022 on the other. So we do not lose hope above all things because we know who fights for us. We are not alone, so we do not despair. And we want to maintain that, whatever else it is that we talk about tonight and tomorrow, because we don't want to think about these things simply in terms of what has gone wrong. What I will share with you tonight and tomorrow is an essentially hopeful, because it is an essentially Christian message. And our gospel is always, even in 2022, a gospel of hope. So what is it more specifically that we're talking about? We're talking, and I'll stop in a couple minutes to take questions that you have so far. We are talking about what is traditionally called the three estates. Now that's kind of a strange word. We really only use the word estate either when we're buying houses or selling them, or when someone dies. So we talk about real estate, and we talk about my father's estate. What it means theologically is simply what someone has established, especially and usually what God has set up or established. Okay? That's an estate. In German and Latin, it's related to the verbs for to be stood up or to stand. It's something set up, right? So think of like a pillar, right? Or what I'm going to ask you to think of, especially tomorrow as we talk about each of the estates in turn, there are traditionally three estates. We're going to talk about them as not estates, but fortresses. Because as we talk about successively the family and the church and the government, the three estates about which Martin Luther would especially speak during Reformation times, I want you to think of them not only as things that God has established, establishing the family and the church in paradise, establishing government after the fall into sin, but I want you to think of them also as refuges God has provided to man for our lives not to be overrun by disorder, by sin, by evil, by chaos of every description. So especially as we think about what will 2022 bring us, what will 2023 bring us, what will 2030 bring us, we don't have to be afraid of the future or even anxious about the future because we know what it is that God has established for peace and for comfort for mankind in these three estates, what we're going to call these three fortresses. I'll stop at this point and mute myself for a second in case you guys have questions. If you don't, I'll just give it a couple seconds and then I'll keep going.
Anybody have any questions? They all raise their hands, but I don't want to ask them, so keep going.
All right, that's fine. So when we think about this idea of refuge, right? I first started thinking about this because I travel. This is the first time my travel plans have ever been foiled by the weather. I travel a lot, and I meet a lot of different people in a lot of different parts of the country. And you know as well as I do, if you travel at all, really, how different parts of the country have become since the implementation of COVID measures going on 2 years ago. Having varying effects in varying places, being enforced differently in different places, being chosen differently in different places. So there are people in Texas who are wearing masks all the time, and there are people in California, even churches, that don't, despite what maybe their local or their state government has said. So the thing that I see most often, that is most common, is utter confusion. There's this sense that people have that life has not actually gotten back to normal. And that if it has, for example, and I don't know precisely what Arizona is like, I know who's in charge of your government, so I have a guess as to what Arizona is like. I know Arizona's warmer than where I am, but I would guess that based on relative commonality in government, that your living conditions are a lot like what I live with in Indiana, which is basically, as far as COVID stuff goes, it's over in Indiana. These things don't impact daily life very much, okay? However, I think that thinking about what could be normal or getting back to normal, that has a limit. Because when we think about history, even recent history, like the past 2 years, we have to realize that we're dealing with something that is, in fact, an effect on life that means that even when you go back to normal, it's not like it was before. That when we go through certain events, either personally in our lives, say the death of a parent, God forbid the death of a child, when we go through things as congregations, a new pastor, a new building, who knows what happens. And certainly when we go through things as a nation or a city, yeah, things are pretty normal. They're not that different, let's say, from 5 years ago. The new pastor isn't radically different than the old pastor. I have the same job as I did 3 months ago before my dad died. Whatever the case may be for anybody. Even if everything else is normal, that still happened. So I still go to work and I think about my dad in a way that I didn't 3 months ago. The new pastor isn't exactly like the old pastor, how similar they are. The nation is still, in many places, going through COVID measures, but not just that. Our sense of what to believe, whom to believe, what is real or unreal, what should affect our daily life or not, is for pretty much all of us different than it was 2 years ago. So we might be normal again, but we're not in another way. And when we think about something as a fortress, we're not saying you go into it the same way that a toddler puts a blanket over his head if he doesn't want his older sibling or maybe his dad to tell him that he's wrong or that he needs to get up from where he is and go to bed or whatever. The toddler believes that when he puts the blanket over his head, he's good to go. And now probably nobody can see him. And now he can do and be whatever he wants to be. Like, for instance, somebody that stays up way past his bedtime. He can just do that because with the blanket over his head, nobody can see him, so he's fine. Christians should not be like toddlers. We're actually called to mature in our faith. So when we think about what God has established in life,
We're not thinking of them as kind of safety blankets or things that we're going to pull over our eyes so that we don't have to watch the world go by or watch history happen or deal with the fact that certain things have happened and nobody can forget about it. Okay? And the reason to think that way is so that we can integrate what we have seen and what we have seen come to pass with what we believe. A lot of what I do on the podcast that I do with Pastor Fisk, Brief History of Power, is attempting to begin to integrate the things that have happened in history with the things that we've always known from the Bible and maybe not paid as much attention to them as we should have. In biblical terms, basically what we're talking about tonight and tomorrow would all fall under the category of wisdom. So a place that you would want to go would, for instance, be the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. You'd go there and, for instance, you'd look and say, hey, how do I know when someone is really not right with God? He doesn't understand who God is or what a kind and gracious, merciful Father he is. He thinks he needs to earn his place before God. How does a person like that behave? And you see Jesus' description of the Pharisees. They make up rules. God didn't make up those rules. They make them up. They don't really follow them themselves, but they make other people follow them. And they're kind of miserable, but other people think that they're really successful, and they may, in fact, in a certain worldly way, be successful. They love to be seen praying and doing whatever else. Jesus' disciples love to hear Jesus' words and integrate them into their lives in ways that other people don't even have to see. Because, as beloved children of the Father, you can see how that doctrine of redemption also plays into how we live our lives in the world and in the creation God has provided. Because we know who we are in Jesus Christ, we have nothing to prove to other people. We can live and move and have our being in the freedom that God gives to his sons. We have nothing to prove. Jesus has done everything we could possibly need. So we don't need to make up rules or make sure that other people are always listening to everything we say. We can live very freely in a world that we know our Father has made. That is, very basically, we live in God's creation in just the way that we know God has redeemed us. That is, freely by his choice for the sake of Jesus Christ. Because the world does not know that, let me say that more specifically, because America does not know that, we have gone through the array of difficulties, distresses, and insanities that we have over the past 2 years. That's why. It is for no other reason than that people who do not know Jesus Christ or know him as deeply as they ought are terrified of control slipping from their grasp, or terrified of physical life going away, or terrified of who knows what, but basically living in fear. They flee, as the Proverbs say it, they flee when no one pursues them. But the righteous man is as bold as a lion because he has nothing to fear. So the things that we're talking about are not fundamentally just, let's have Pastor Koontz make some observations about what's wrong with people's lives. Okay? I'm probably not going to tell you anything tonight or tomorrow that has not in some form already occurred to you, because God's Spirit lives in you, you know his word, and you observe what is going on around you. I'm simply trying to organize clearly to remind you of these things so that you can be strengthened in these things and not despair or succumb yourself to fear. That's really all that's happening. So here's what we're talking about let's begin to introduce the estates themselves in brief tonight. And if you can only join us for tonight, or you only have time if you're watching this later, to watch this one right now, you'll have some idea before we do everything else tomorrow at greater length. Why only 3 estates? I think partly Luther only proposed 3 estates because it's easy to remember. Okay? And I don't, as somebody who teaches for a living, I don't blame him for that at all. Okay? When you're teaching people, sometimes you make things a little too clear at first, and then they can later figure out that you were a little too clear, it's more nuanced, it's more complicated, and then your students can also feel like they're smarter than you because they think they're thinking of something you've never thought of. And that's great, and then they can get smarter and they feel good about it, and it's fantastic. Let me give you an example of why 3, family, church, and government, might be just a little too clear. I referred earlier to that idea of the table of duties. That is kind of in the back of your small catechism. It's not always something that everyone who goes through, say, a confirmation class is going to have to memorize or something. I always take people through it just because I think it's so helpful. It's just a collection of Bible verses arranged according to different stations, or a word that we've probably thought of already, maybe tonight, but I haven't quite used, vocation, arranged according to different vocations in life. So if you're a pastor, here's some advice. If you're what the table of duties call a hearer, here's some advice. Meaning that primary relationship in the Christian church centers around preaching. We'll talk about that when we talk about the fortress of the church tomorrow. If you're a husband, here's this. If you're a wife, here's this. If you're somebody's child, here's this. If you are employed by someone or employ someone, here's this. So something to notice, for example, is that if you have 3 estates, you could maybe have 4, because Luther includes under the family what we would think of as the economy or economic or financial employment relationships. He partly does that because in his time, in the 16th century, it's a lot more normal for people not just to work from home, but to work at home. To have a farm, to have a craft or a trade, they do at home. Relatively few people work somewhere outside a household altogether, and even if they do have a separate property where they print something or make clothing or something, it's probably more or less a family business. So finance, economics, money, all flows in and out of and exists for the family. There's a way in which that isn't our world at all, right? Our world centers generally on working somewhere outside the family, but there's a way in which that's very theologically insightful, because it means that when I think about money, when I think about finance, I don't use the term career as if there's like this other realm where I make money and, advance or whatever it is that I'm doing at work, separate from or not for the family. Then what do we mean by the family? We'll talk a lot about definition tomorrow morning, but we mean very simply a man and a woman and their children. There are other ways we can think about that: extended family, multiple generations, either older or younger. But that is the very basic group that is instituted before the fall into sin. So that's where we start: a man and a woman, and the children that God gives them, the family. Then there's the church. I mentioned already that Luther thinks about the church as basically being related to preaching. Okay? So not just all the activities that could go on at a church, not just all the things that people do, the positions they hold, the stuff that Pastor Larson could have read off in my biography, okay, which I am extremely thankful he didn't, because I have probably heard that 45 times and I know exactly what my position is called, and that I direct field education at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And when I graduated from graduate school, and I'm very thankful that he didn't make me listen to all of that, because it would have been the 46th time, and I don't know if I could have handled that. Okay, so we're very thankful to Pastor Larson. The check is already in the mail of my thanks to him for that. The church is not about the titles that anyone in the church holds. Congregational president, head trustee, pastor, director of this, that, or the other thing. The church is constituted by the proclamation of God's word and the fact that people actually believe it. Amazing. If you don't think that the church is amazing, think about if it didn't exist. Think about if that word were silenced, or you had never heard that word of the gospel which saves souls. I mean, in some cases in the Bible, very literally and obviously, the Philippian jailer is at the point of despair because he thinks that he has completely messed up at his job. And if you completely mess up at your job, obviously your boss is, if you're in the Roman army or something sort of like it, your boss will want to execute you, and he is ready to commit suicide in Acts because he is worried that life really can't go on after this. You know, here's the thing that I'm facing in life, this life that I've chosen, and if this happens, it's all over. And Paul says very simply, do not be afraid, we are all here. So he asks, what must I do to be saved? To continue having a life or to have a new life, what must I do to be saved? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved, you and all your household. That is the most basic definition of the church. Paul preaching to the Philippian jailer and then baptizing his whole household, repentant and believing. Very basic. The building can help, the positions can help, the training can help, all the amazing stuff that we have in and for the church. That's the most basic thing that the gospel goes forth to sinners. It's only basic in the sense that it's simple. It's not basic in the sense that we think, oh, a kid knows that, so I'm going to move on to more complex things. Something I think you'll find in the crises or assaults on the family, the church, and the government that we'll talk about tomorrow is that very often the assaults on these things, these divine institutions, these divine fortresses, are not very clever or complex. They're very simple. But likewise, the gospel is very simple. It's meant for everybody. It's not kind of an intellectual quiz. And because it's meant for everybody, it is therefore marvelous and capable of saving anyone, however unlikely. So I am incredibly hopeful about the church, not only the family, not only the government, but especially the church, because I understand what it is about the gospel which is so mighty. Before we talk just a little bit about the government, to introduce that idea and then wrap up for this evening, any questions or comments, thoughts at this point that you'd like to contribute?
Anybody? Sure. All right, none again. You're saying everything that they're thinking.
All right, I mean, that sounds good to me. All right, well, let's talk a little bit then about the government, and then I want to talk about where I think this rebellion that I've spoken of comes from. I've said already that I think it has a supernatural source. That is, I don't think that, we are now somehow making war on flesh and blood after 2,000 plus years of Christian history. I think our warfare is still not against flesh and blood. It's not against this or that person or group of persons. It is against Satan and his desire to enslave man to himself. So I want to talk about what kinds of desires he's trying to stir up within man to make war on these divine institutions. But let's talk just briefly about that third fortress, the government, and what I mean by that exactly, because I don't want that to be confused with some specific, because Luther doesn't say, well, the form of government you need to use is an absolute monarchy or a democratic republic, or you need to have a state that is this big and no bigger, or this small and no smaller, or whatever the case may be. When we're talking about government, okay, or what is called usually in this kind of image type of way, this metaphor in Scripture, the sword, we're talking about a certain power which is given after the fall into sin in order to curb sin. So we're not talking about something that would need to exist in a world without sinners. Okay. Luther will even go so far as to say, when in the treatise on Christian liberty, which is marvelous, part of a series of just absolutely wonderful things that he writes between 1520 and 1521, because so much is changing. You know, you're just a couple years into a very public version of Reformation. So it's not just Luther making discoveries, you know, in his study anymore. Now he's gone public, kind of sort of kicking off with the 95 Theses, and consequences are beginning to roll in real time, in the real world. Political consequences, military consequences, certainly church consequences, and eventually, even for Luther personally, a couple of years later, family consequences, as he realizes that it's actually okay for a clergyman to be married, which, you know, having 7 children, I'm very happy that Luther figured out that was okay. I enjoy both being a pastor and having 7 kids. So a lot of these things are coming together for him, and he writes this marvelous treatise. This is a great place to go after this weekend for further study on Christian liberty, on the freedom of a Christian. And he says, you know, in effect, if everyone were actually a believing Christian, so not just that there were churches or everyone were baptized and somehow on the rolls of a church, because obviously it is time and place everyone is, practically speaking. But that if everyone actually believed in Jesus Christ, you wouldn't really need harsh military authority, because we would not be set at enmity with each other. We would live in peace and harmony. Now, whether or not that's strictly speaking historically true, you understand what he's getting at. Okay? Which is that the sword is there, as Paul says in Romans 13, to punish wickedness. It's not there to micromanage your life. It's there to punish outbreaks of sin. The sword makes sure that a guy that is breaking into people's cars constantly in, say, San Francisco, doesn't just get to do it with impunity. And if you live in San Francisco in 2022, your only real option, because there are so many break-ins, is simply to put a sign in your window saying, there's nothing in here, and you remove not just your valuables, but anything from your car every single day, so that you don't get it taken from you. And you're just going to have to replace your window once again. This sword is there, government, not any specific form, just the fact that someone has that power is there to punish wickedness. And then there's a pair there in Romans 13, and to reward goodness. That is, it's not there to hinder you from doing things that are good, but to encourage you to do things that are good. So you would want the government to encourage, for example, people to live upright lives, or to form and to maintain coherent families, because that would be good. That would be good for men, good for women, good for children. So it's not exactly it could be a very extensive form of government. So, for example, in the large catechism, right, in our confessions, Luther's going to say that he wants the princes to stop putting their faces on the coins. He wants them to put bread on the coins, put a loaf of bread there on the face of the coin, so that everyone can remember what it is that the government needs to be doing, which is making that definition of daily bread that you can get in the small catechism, including faithful neighbors, peaceful times, good government, That's there. That's what the government needs to be providing. It needs to make life orderly and peaceful so that evil people do not run rampant and good people are actually allowed to lead the good lives, whether upright in just kind of an outward sense or also upright in an inward Christian sense. They can lead those good lives in peace. Okay? So it's not that government is going to rule everything or make every decision. It has a specific thing that it needs to do, and it doesn't need to do more than that, but it also should not do, as I think I'm charging San Francisco city government with doing right now, it should not do less than that, okay? So those are the three fortresses that we're talking about, and we'll go into a lot more detail tomorrow about each of them in turn. Let me talk about how I think let's say these fortresses, where are you getting the troops, the bodies, the souls? Where are you getting the people to go against these fortresses? Because the way that I have laid them out, I don't think that every single person, certainly every non-Christian would agree with what I've already said to you tonight. But I do think that you could lay out a fairly reasonable vision of life in which you say, look, the family has a certain way that it naturally exists biologically. People want to worship God according to their understanding, according to the dictates of their conscience. That's actually enshrined in all kinds and levels of American law. Thank God that it's there. We would have a much more uphill fight as church in the United States if it weren't there already. Hey, government is there to make life not as awful as it would otherwise be if people would just run around doing whatever they wanted. And a lot of people, both Christian and non-Christian, could maybe agree with that. We're not making war on flesh and blood, but people don't get their desire to hate the family or the church or government. And I don't mean by that any specific form or party, even just the fact that wickedness needs to be punished and goodness should be rewarded. They don't get their desire to hate those things from nowhere. I used the word propaganda earlier in connection with our news media, which I have contended elsewhere is not really all that distinct from our entertainment media. That is, the reason that things change so quickly among us, and the reason that these three fortresses are undergoing assaults and difficulties that appear unprecedented in our own lifetimes and have developed so rapidly in a way which seems really kind of unthinkable to us. So for example, can you imagine that churches would be burned in the United States or even Canada, which has a different legal form than we do, certainly around freedom of religion. But the Canadians especially, but even we also, dealt, the Canadians last year in a big way, us a little bit more in 2020 during lockdowns, such as they were in the United States. Churches were burned as a kind of way of blaming them for various things, right? In Canada, it's been more or less sort of an epidemic of church burning, especially in the prairie provinces. Why are these things occurring? Did we ever think that we would see that kind of thing happen almost systemically in Western countries? How can people change their opinions so rapidly from something that used to have a lot of prestige? I mean, sometimes people would even become pastors almost for a bad reason, that it was a job that carried kind of a lot of social prestige. You were kind of honored in the community. It was sort of like being a doctor, right? Now it's more like being, with apologies to anyone in the audience tonight, it's more like being a lawyer. People kind of instinctively distrust you very often if you say that you're a clergyman, and even if you say that you're a Christian. How did that change so rapidly? How so rapidly did we go from Barack Obama feels that in order to get elected as a national candidate, he needs to affirm that he's against legalized gay marriage in 2008, to the point where it's really unthinkable, certainly for a Democratic candidate and probably practically for a Republican candidate, to say, I think we should go back to outlawing gay marriage. That's unlikely now, probably in our next presidential election, that any candidate of either major party would say that. How did we go so rapidly from the government is here to kind of facilitate certain things about life, but not to tell you what to do, to the idea that the government should, in fact, largely through the media, tell you what to do for your own benefit, right? In a way that impinges on your daily life, your medical decisions, etc. That's kind of all up to the government. We went there rapidly because media is really the conduit for changing people's minds. If you take media really broadly, the church has always known this. The church is given the divine medium of preaching, the proclamation of the Word of God. Also, when we celebrate the sacraments, the Word of God is proclaimed, specifically in connection with baptism, specifically in connection with the Lord's Supper. We use this divinely instituted medium to give forgiveness, life, and salvation to sinners. The church has always understood this, but here's something that changed. In 1952, a year I referenced earlier, it would be possible for a person largely to consume media. That's just before television becomes fairly normal in American homes. A person's media consumption would be confined to the kind of relatively calm, once-a-day contemplation of newspapers, and maybe, but at generally definite times of the day, because you would have a schedule of radio programs, And even in those news media, deference to the traditional family, what we would say is the divinely instituted family, the man, the woman, and the child, and deference to the church was expected. Even to the extent that Hollywood would censor itself in order to have its films not be boycotted by the enormous majority of the population that would not see a kind of picture if it presented the family or the church or anything else in a poor light. Okay? Now, and especially since the advent of smartphones, the media are constantly in front of you, okay, if you want to. In a way that has changed us, I think, profoundly, so profoundly that we really have trouble expressing it or understanding it. It's a little easier to understand for those of us who can remember a time before smartphones. It's harder for especially younger people to even conceive of a world in which you wouldn't touch your phone the first thing you do in the morning and the last thing you do before you're actually physically asleep, probably with the phone in your hand or right next to where you can reach. Okay? So when people have trouble, for instance, praying, which I think is probably a perennial difficulty for sinners, none of us prays as much as he thinks he ought to, or about as much as certainly we need to spiritually. But one of the first things that I will tell new converts to Christianity is I want you to touch your hands together and to pray, even very briefly, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner, or the Lord's Prayer, or Luther's morning prayer. Touch your hands together and do that with your eyes closed, just before you touch your phone. That's all I'm asking you to do. In order to integrate prayer into your life, just start there. The reason that I have to ask that is because this way of getting media into our lives has become constant, rapid, intense. That is how you change people's minds, or to say it, I think, a little more deeply, because I think this is what constant attention to media does to people. This is how you change people's souls. So, the things that we struggle against, the assaults that we face that we'll talk about, specific to the family, specific to the church, specific to the government, I don't think any of this really would have been spiritually and therefore practically possible without smartphones. I don't even think it would have been possible, it would have been possible just with TV. Now with TV, you can certainly mold public opinion, right? So to give you an example of that, there was relatively widespread television by the time the Korean War ended. There was certainly widespread radio and newspapers, but the media never engaged in a kind of constant publication. See if this sounds familiar to you from the past 2 years. During the Korean War, the media did not provide us with running death counts for American soldiers on the Korean Peninsula. By the time of Vietnam, after a certain time in Vietnam, roughly 1968, 3 years into our official involvement in Vietnam, the media began to provide, especially on the nightly news, death counts of how many American soldiers had died or been wounded, how many casualties in total we had. You see the power of that, right? You see the power of case counts with COVID, death counts with COVID. Now, a lot of us have learned to see, okay, not everyone that dies with COVID dies of COVID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've all thought about this way too much. The mere fact is the provision of death counts is already shaping opinion in a way that will cause public opinion to change much more rapidly in a very definite direction than not providing death counts. Having no idea of how horrible and harsh certain campaigns in Korea were, or what our death rates in certain units were in the Korean War, a war about which most Americans know practically nothing, to the extent that probably if you asked an 18-year-old, did we ever fight a war in Korea, he probably would tell you no, having forgotten those 15 minutes in US history in high school. So, I don't think that we would really be having the things that we're talking about together tonight and tomorrow. None of this would be coming up if it weren't for smartphones. I don't say that in order to say, well, just get rid of your smartphone and you've gotten rid of the problem. Because you do that, still basically everybody else has a smartphone. And even if we got rid of them tomorrow, okay, this is why I look at this sort of like the way that I was talking about COVID earlier. You can say life is back to normal. Let's just all go back to 2007. There's no COVID and there's no smartphones. Still, media functions the same way. It just would have to go by a different route. But we deal with the things that we deal with because of the way that information comes to us, and the way that that information is not shaped by the Word of God. What we want to do is understand that therefore the things that are stirred up in people by the educational system, the media they consume, whatever else it is that shapes their perception, all of that is operating, I think, kind of like the existence or the non-existence of death counts. It's basically sub-rational. Why are people sad? Why are they anxious? I don't know. Maybe it has to do with being on their phones 5 hours a day. There's nothing specific about the information they're consuming. Maybe they're looking at the news. Maybe they're looking at cat videos. I don't really think it matters. On a sub-rational level, it's just the sense that the thing on their phone is so much more important than anything else going on in life. On a sub-rational sense, it doesn't really matter militarily if the Korean War was more or less winnable or more or less worthwhile fighting than the Vietnam War. What matters for people's everyday lives and sense of how things are going is whether they know how many boys have died over there or not. Human beings are stirred by deep things. Things that are usually lower down and harder to access. Whether emotions or convictions, deeper and harder to access than just mere information. So you could approach somebody and you could say, do you know how likely it is that someone will have an enormous amount of trouble in life if his parents don't stay together? Do you know how hard statistically that is? Do you know all the things that go on in people's lives, what they're so much likelier to engage in that's detrimental to themselves and everybody else if they didn't grow up with a dad in the house? That's probably not going to convince somebody who has sub-rational convictions about other forms of the family. You know, families can kind of take any shape, right? It's probably not going to convince him right then and there that he needs to stay with his wife, that he needs to work it out, that he needs to get through the difficulties they're having right now. Because if he walks away from this, or if she walks away from this is going to have effects they don't understand. Because you see all the other media he's ever consumed, news media, entertainment media, most of what he's been told in life throughout his education, however far he's gone with that, has told him that life is what he makes of it. He's going to be defined by his choices, including his choice that he's done with this. Okay? He can't handle this anymore, and it's going to be fine because even though they're not going to be living together anymore and mommy and daddy are going to be seeing other people, he still loves his kids. And, you know, they just have differences that, you know, people just grow apart. Phrases, ideas, ways of imagining the future that he got from media. Probably from some movie he's watched 3 or 4 times in a bored way on his laptop. It sounds pedestrian or little. It's really not. He's been shaped profoundly. This man who's considering giving up on his family, he's been shaped profoundly by things that probably the church never talked about if he ever got inside a church. So we want to talk about these things because we want to be prepared to give people a better sense of how God has made them to be, what life is, and, as I said before, how the gospel relates to all of that. At this point, there's a little bit more that I can say, but I want to stop for questions or thoughts if you guys have them, because I don't want to have no time at the end of tonight for those. So any questions or thoughts that anybody has? Any hands up, or all the hands up once again?
We have one. I did not slip him $10 either.
Dr. Koontz, can you hear me? First of all, I'm an attorney, so one strike against me.
I know you're paid.
I'm one of Pastor Larson's elders. I just had a thought that I just wanted to share. Objective reality for all 3 estates, it would seem, has been completely set aside. Actively promoted in the schools is relativism. I mean, you I think attribute a lot of the adoption of different norms to, let's say, media, other, stimuli, if you will. What would you attribute the abandonment of objective, even the term objective justification? If you took a poll, I would think of Missouri Synod Lutherans, I would venture to guess maybe 30 to 40% would even know what you're talking about. I mean, and that's pretty sad to me. That's just a thought and a question.
No, that's a great question. And I think that when you think about education as an activity, as resembling media, or media consumption as resembling education, it gets easier to see how these things work together in a person's life. So, for instance, a phrase that came up a lot, even when I started undergrad, although transgenderism was not really operative, certainly not politically, it was there as sort of an idea. I went to a very left-wing college, so if we were going to support anything, if somebody was going to be supporting transgenderism in the early 2000s, it would have been my alma mater. Or just, let's say, my mater, because it's not very Alma to me in that way, but my mater, we would be doing it. And nonetheless, we were not doing it, but we were using a phrase constantly, social construct. And that's pulled in from the academic discipline of sociology, and it simply means that something like the father being the head of the household is not natural, a word that we really were not permitted to use without irony. It's not natural, it's not objective, it's just a result of various historical processes that could therefore be changed because we can imagine situations in which the father is not the head of the household, not the head of the family. So I think that what you're dealing with as far as an abandonment of objective reality is that, especially whether it's in the educational system, in any subject that isn't the natural sciences, okay, which now themselves are being kind of colonized by these ideas. So, you know, the idea that, you know, objectivity in, let's say, higher mathematics is like white, right, and therefore bad, right? So, you know, maybe we need to change the SAT or the ACT because, you know, the ways that we're expecting students to perform regardless of race is discriminatory and bad and whatever because of this, you know, differing outcomes when measured by race for students. Whatever the case may be, that's, you know, this is slipping from the humanities into the sciences, but it's also slipping from, and a long time ago slipped, from our, let's say, entertainment media into our ways of thinking about life. So, if I can, and this is why you'll get documentaries on TV or YouTube or whatever, kind of tracing, let's say, like the first gay character in Star Wars, or the first, you know, woman to be a combat figure in this or that franchise. Why do they talk about stuff like that? Because they understand the power simply of seeing those things in a film, on a TV show, because most people, and this is where I think the question of, you know, you really have to tell people what objective reality is. Because most people can't tell the difference. If they've seen it in front of their eyes, and no one has told them this isn't real, they believe, at least I think in kind of a subconscious fashion, that it is real. You know? An example of that would be, I think a lot of, let's say, women maybe my age and younger, unless they've actually thought about this, might be surprised to learn that men are just a lot physically stronger than women. That like a 15-year-old boy could beat that, could beat like the world's strongest woman probably at any contest by virtue of who he is biologically. The reason that a woman might be surprised by that, or a younger man might be surprised by that fact, is simply because he's seen so often, you know, kind of a girl boss action figure beating some guy up in a movie, and people can't tell the difference between what they've seen with their eyes, even in a movie, and what is real, unless they are educated otherwise, and all of that unreal stuff is not presented to them as real. But it's presented as real, they're watching it constantly, they're watching that movie, you know, 25, 50 times, which, you know, streaming makes possible, very possible. The VHS is not going to wear out, right? And they're not being educated to think that objectivity is actually valuable. At this point, to some degree, not even in the natural sciences, you know? So I think that education and media work very similarly to each other. And without being educated that objectivity exists or natural things exist and here's what they are, a lot of people never get to that point of recognizing them. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts?
No, I don't think so. Oh,
right.
one more.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Pastor Koontz, you were saying the explosion with the smartphones and stuff like that in regards to how we interface now. I think going further back is the introduction of the internet, because now the smartphones have a way to go to the internet to find information, and the media, like you were saying before, was it seems like they tended to mask what was going on or in the world and tell just what they felt that they needed to tell the folks. That was it. And then as soon as the internet came around and there was more forms of information that came available, they lost that opportunity to watch or to make their information adaptable to the individuals. And so then you start having this stuff with the body counts and things like that, because they wanted to bring the people back into them, as opposed to having those other, the internet allowing additional information to news places that come out.
Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying with the smartphones, but I think there's other things that were happening, and I think it would have happened eventually anyway, even without that stuff, because the media would eventually have gotten to that point, I think, and gotten to where they started to manipulate what they wanted to have done. And as people have gone through this stage where we were church-based back in the 50s and 60s, those individuals left the companies. The new ones coming in did not have the background I'm feeling, because of the religious background and stuff like that has been slowly eroding as the time has progressed. And so the feeling is that it would have happened eventually, regardless of how technology would have come along.
Yeah.
So that's just my analysis type of thing. If you want to expand on it, that's fine. I mean, but it's just something else that I think that's there, that people need to realize that it's not just the smartphone. Although I understand what you're saying, the smartphone, they use that constantly.
Yeah.
That's their companion. When people are walking down the street talking to each other on their cell phones, and they're standing right next to each other. That's ridiculous. That's just totally ridiculous. So.
No, that's right. And I think, and Laura pointed out in the chat that people have always had, she said, human beings have always had stories, gossip, self-centered plots, superstition, and plenty of people believed it. And that's totally true. I think if I can kind of bring together what you said with Laura's comment, because I think they do mesh well. A category I wish we had talked more about before 2020 is the category that Christians have always recognized and actually predates Christianity. Romans would talk about this, is the category of superstition. That is, strange behaviors that don't actually achieve what you're saying they achieve on the basis of information that turns out to be false. And I think that the issue here is that as far as media control goes, one thing that smartphones have achieved, but also was already taking place before smartphones with, especially Facebook, is the capacity not only to give a greater constancy to the information, which is what smartphones do, but to take that bewildering array of information on the internet and to kind of herd internet users onto social media platforms, where they're mainly talking to or thinking about each other, right? So you take the internet, and this is why, I mean, I'm not like a Luddite, like it's like, well, let's just get rid of the internet and then we're good. Because actually, something I love about the internet, apart from social media and apart from smartphones, is the access to information other than ABC Nightly News and the New York Times, right? Like there is still, and there certainly was, especially when internet users were presumptively anonymous, right? Like that was the norm, and then needing to identify yourself on the internet was unusual. That actually provides a great freedom and an array of information that you wouldn't otherwise have. What you get, I think, moving out of that sort of, if I can talk about it as the internet as a kind of research university, or even just a library. You're wandering around, you're finding stuff, no one's stopping and asking you, why are you reading books about chemistry? Now you're reading books about Brazilian history, whatever. But you can just go wherever and find things out. Now you're kind of herded into this sort of village atmosphere on social media, where really what you're worried about is what other people think, right? And then if that's also the place where you're now going to get your information about the world and life and stuff, then it's much easier to kind of control the flow of information. So I think social media solved some problems. It didn't resolve them, but it at least mitigated some problems that legacy media was having, because the internet provided a freedom and array of ideas that, honestly, people in 1990 could not have without access to a really amazing library, right? So there were really good things about that. I think that we have now been, most people certainly have been herded back into that kind of village way of thinking about life, where it's like, okay, well, what does Dave that I work with think? Okay, he probably won't like that, so I'm never going to say that, so now I end up never discussing that with anybody. So I think that, the internet has changed us in a variety of ways. They're not all bad. A lot of the things that I talk about on the podcast, for example, it just wouldn't be possible for me to find either information about them, and certainly not to get books about them, without the internet. So, I mean, in that sense, thank God for the internet. But the ways that it has been shaped, certainly in the past 15 years, I think have largely been detrimental to creative thought or coherent thought, because it's really more about getting people to like what it is that I'm doing or saying. Any other questions or thoughts for tonight? We're now a little bit over time, so I don't want this to turn into a hostage situation. I'm very aware of that possibility. Anybody else?
I don't see anyone, so.
Okay.
I will send you a message after the service, as long as you're going to be up for about an hour or so. Or are you going to go back to bed? All right. Send you a message, and then we'll get all set up for tomorrow.
Okay, that sounds great. I will talk to you guys in the morning.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
We talk about how bad smartphones are, and then I'm like, I'll send you a message on the smartphone. There you go. So we're going to get this down. I'm going to get ready for the service.